Welcome, fight fans. We're here for another prediction video for one of the biggest fights of the year in Canelo Alvarez, returning to 175 pounds, the light heavyweight limit, to challenge Dimitri Bivol for Bivol's WBA title. Very, very interesting fight. A lot of people are going for Canelo. I think a lot of that is just because a lot of people aren't familiar with Bivol, but I want to take a little bit of a look behind the numbers, particularly from their recent fights, to give an indicator of who might have the advantage going into Saturday night, really in a few hours. I took some numbers from CompuBox, and they're very, very interesting. One of the things I've been able to determine is that Bivol is far and away the best defensive fighter that Canelo is going to have faced since probably Erislandy Lara. Let's look at some of the numbers. So Bivol, as far as opponents connecting in their power punches, he holds them to roughly about 22%. Among the top 50 fighters in the world that CompuBox keeps stats on, that's good for number one. So he's number one out of all the elite fighters in all the divisions in boxing at this time. Also, opponents connect percentage overall. Opponents normally only connect with about 12.5% of their punches on Bivol. That's overall punches. That's also good for number one among active elite fighters, and of course, number one among champions. Very, very interesting. Now, here's on the flip side, because we don't really associate Bivol with being a good offensive fighter, but regarding his jab, he lands his jab at a connect percentage of about 67%, which is good for number one among active fighters as well. As far as the number of jabs he lands per round, he lands roughly about 9, and that's good for number two among active fighters. And who's number one? That would be none other than Gennady Golovkin, who, as we know, gave Canelo really his last toughest challenge back in 2018. And he was able to do that primarily with what? The jab. Very, very interesting. But here's where I'm having some issues with Bivol as far as picking him as a favorite in this fight. So I just posted the article. I have it in the comment section. It's called, "Has a 2019 punch already doomed Dimitri Bivol's chances against Canelo?" So what 2019 punch am I talking about? Back in 2019, Bivol defended his title against Joe Smith Jr., who was going to be facing Artur Beterbiev, and what most people are predicting is a potential fight of the year next month at Madison Square Garden. As we know, Bivol pretty much dominated that fight. I think he only probably, if anything, maybe gave him a round, maybe two, that he lost. But there was something that happened very telling in that fight in round 10. Literally, as the bell is about to ring, Bivol comes with a lead left hook. Normally, what Bivol does is he kind of jabs with his left hand and then hooks off the jab. But this time, he came straight with a left hook. Joe Smith, he timed it perfectly. He came over the top with an overhand right, and it badly hurt Bivol at the bell. I mean, he literally just for a second didn't know where he was, and he stumbles back to his corner. Now, a fighter getting hurt in the fight, no big deal, right? You know, it's a fight. You're going to be taking punches. But after that fight, or not even after that fight, for the next two rounds, he was mostly defensive, mostly retreating, clinching. Makes sense, right? You're using that to recover. And then in the last round, in the last couple seconds, he landed a good right hand and he flurried to close out the fight. Normally, that's not a big deal. You'll kind of look at that as, you know, a fighter got hurt. We saw it recently with Devin Haney and Jorge Linares. It happens, right? But it's different in this case with Bivol, because literally after that fight, you can document by the numbers how his style changed up. After that fight, he was a fighter that pretty much you can always count on to, build his offense off his jab. But as the fight went on, he picked up his power punches. The reverse has happened since then. And all the fights that he's had since the Joe Smith fight has been 3. It's been where he's primarily relying on his jab more than his power punches. Very, very big difference. In the Lenin Castillo fight, and that was in late 2019, that was the first fight that's documented on CompuBox where he's landed more jabs than power punches. Now, we still dropped Castillo in the 6th round, so we still know that he had that punching power there, but he landed 118 jabs compared to 70 power punches. Then if you look at the next fight against Craig Richards, this is a fight where it was a big disparity where he landed 164 jabs compared to 70 power punches. And he landed double-digit jabs in 10 of the 12 rounds. So primarily in 10 of those 12 rounds, his staple offensive punch was really just his jab. And he only landed in double digits regarding his power punches in one round in that whole fight. So that kind of lets you know, at this point, it looks like he's becoming a more safety first fighter. We've seen that in the past. A famous example would be Hector Camacho after he was hurt against Edwin Rosario. The big knock on him afterward was that he became a safety first fighter. And that seems by the numbers what we're seeing in Bivol. And then in his last fight in December, same thing applies. This was the first fight that his power punch connect was at his lowest since CompuBox has been documenting spikes going back to 2015. So he landed 69 power punches compared to 178 jabs, and he threw 565 jabs in total. Very big output in the jabs. And even in the last fight I didn't mention with Richards, he threw 443 jabs compared to 176 power shots. So we're seeing a fighter that at this point is relying almost strictly on his jab more than anything. So the question becomes, can you beat Canelo Alvarez with a jab-heavy style? We know it can disrupt him. We saw that with Mayweather. We saw it with Golovkin. But Mayweather, and I was ringside for that fight. I thought he won that fight going away. But what happened on the scorecards? There was a judge who luckily is no longer judging that scored that fight a draw. And then we see, as good as people think Golovkin did in his two fights against Canelo, he didn't win either one. And he dominated both of those fights with the jab. And his jab is stronger and more authoritative than Bivol's jab. So that gives me a lot of pause. So when you're looking at everything that's stepped up against Bivol, in order for him to win, it can't be the style that we've seen in his most recent fights, really his last three fights. We're really going to need to see what he showed against Sullivan Barrera, even Isaac Chilemba, and of course, Jean Pascal. In every one of those fights, it's a marked difference when you look at the punch stats. He, in all of those fights, landed more power punches than jabs. He was more active, 3 to 4 punch combinations, went to the head and to the body, kept on the move. And even in the Pascal fight, he landed 127 total power punches with a 44% connect rate, which is phenomenal. Even in the Chilemba fight, Chilemba is more of a spoiler. He still landed 50% of his power punches. I believe 87 power punches. And that fight was more of a strategic fight, but he still landed more power punches than jabs. He landed about 67 jabs in that fight. So when it comes down to who is going to potentially win this fight, I think there's too many things in Canelo's favor. Number one, you can call it the Canelo plot armor. And basically that is, the judges seem to always favor his style, no matter how he's fighting. When he was fighting off the back foot against Golovkin in the first match, which most of us thought he lost, he was still able to manage to get a draw. And when he was coming forward, against Golovkin in the rematch, still close, but he managed to get out the win in that one. Even in the Mayweather fight, which he clearly lost, he got a draw on one of those scorecards. In the Lara fight, which is another close fight, there was one judge in there that had it wide for Canelo as well. So just his style and just the fact that he's such a big moneymaker, that's a lot to overcome against a fighter that, number one, is not well known and recently has had a jab-heavy style. It's going to be hard to beat Canelo if he's still using that style when Canelo's a flashier puncher, going to the body, coming forward. In close rounds, the judges are probably going to favor Canelo. And also the optics are going to be working against Bivol too, because he's a bigger fighter. And if you're on the move and off the back foot, moving backwards, it's going to look more in Canelo's favor as a smaller man that's coming forward and seeming like he's walking you down. And plus, you're going to have the crowd going crazy for anything that he does, which can sway the judges. So number one, I feel Canelo has that plot armor, quote unquote, with the judges. And number two, he has the experience edge. This man has been in big fights going on about nearly 10 years now. The Mayweather fight, I believe, was back in 2013. You consider that his first big Cinco de Mayo fight. He's been in big fights, numerous big fights since then. So he has the experience edge. He's seen all types of styles. He's gone up in weight before. He's cleaned out 168 pounds. So he's seen every imaginable style that you can see as a fighter. Bivol hasn't experienced that yet. This is his first big fight on this type of stage. He's had some, solid opponents with Pascal and Smith, and Joe Smith, and even Sullivan Barrera. And I would also put Chalimba in there as a solid win at the time, but nothing compared to what Canelo has faced. So Canelo has the experience edge. I mentioned earlier, style-wise, optics-wise, Canelo coming forward, I think that's going to benefit him in the close rounds. And then we have the mental question. I just went over how his style has become more jab heavy since he got rocked in the 10th round against Joe Smith. Canelo is going to connect with something hard at some point, whether it's a headshot or whether it's a body shot. Is he going to go into retreat like Lara did over the second half of the fight? Or is he going to also revert back to what we've seen in recent fights, just staying away and trying to work the jab? So mentality-wise, I have a lot of questions about how Bivol is going to react once he gets hit with that first big punch. One thing I will say that's an advantage for Bivol is just physically, he's a bigger man. I'm not sure who has the speed advantage relative to size. Of course, I think Canelo's a faster fighter at 168, but we're not fighting at 168. This is a 175-pound matchup. The Canelo that I saw against Kovalev is not the faster fighter than Bivol. However, this is a new Canelo. He's coming up in weight again, so he's more comfortable at this weight. So it's still kind of a toss-up. But if I had to go with who I think is a faster man, hand speed-wise, I would go with Bivol, and definitely footwork-wise, is Bivol as well. So those physical attributes will work in his favor, but when you add everything up, I think it's just too much for him to overcome. I think it's going to be a Canelo decision, perhaps controversial decision, but I think at this point, there's too much in his favor style-wise, and also the fact that, let's face it, Canelo has signed a 3-fight deal with Matchroom, and we know that there's a very lucrative rubber match on the horizon with Gennady Golovkin in September. That fight is going to happen by hook or by crook. So if it's a close fight, I see those Vegas judges leaning towards Canelo to get the win. So let me know what you think. We're only a couple hours away, so we'll get the answer. But are you picking Bivol to win, or do you think Canelo will continue his path of dominance and pick up his second title at 175 pounds?